Hi guys, welcome to the show. My name is Seb Ostrovich, aka the Voice of the People, and this is the Weightlifting House podcast.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Weightlifting House podcast. I'm your host, Joshua Gibson, and I'm joined today by a slightly different figure. He's from a different sport, but it's a strength sport, so still very related. And I think in the world of weightlifting, people can always use more strength, especially in the squat and in the pull, which are the contested lifts from the sport that Jason kind of comes from, which is powerlifting. So Jason, I'll just give a quick background and we can fill in the gaps if you feel there are any. You know, Jason's been in strength and physique sports, but also in other strength and conditioning roles. He's the co-founder of the Strength Guys, which is a company providing coaching services to drug-free powerlifters, bodybuilders, and competitive athletes. What's really interesting is he's worked with NASCAR teams, an NHL team, and other well-known coaches and organizations. So it's a really well-rounded background, and I feel like that's given you an opportunity to develop like a very broad skill set, not only within the sport of powerlifting, which is sometimes, you know, people get started in a strength sport, they specialize really aggressively, and it might limit their development. So I think it's really cool that you've been able to diversify so much.
Yeah, thank you. I've been practicing now for almost a decade. Graduate of the Mount Royal University Personal Fitness Training Certificate Program. Decided I wanted more knowledge, so went back and got my Bachelor's of Health and Physical Education, which I just finished this past December. You're exactly right that I've tried to be more well-rounded as a coach by learning strength and conditioning methods. So I've interned under Brett Bartholomew for almost 2 years and coached Dan Noble at the Hill Academy in Toronto. And then Coach Ryan Van Asten and Coach Alan Selby with the Calgary Flames NHL team, which I'm actively providing sports science templates for the Calgary Flames NHL team as well. I've used snippets of knowledge from each coach and each past experience in order to form what I felt was the most comprehensive approach for powerlifting training. I think there's a lot of things in the online, in the world of online training where I'll hear blanket statements like you can't coach technique online, or, you know, casting doubt about the effectiveness of a simple approach to monitoring training volume and training intensity and adjusting the program based on that. But as my colleague at the Strength Guys, Ben Escrow, and I have worked within our training system, within our database training system, we found over and over again that, you know, 9 times out of 10, we've been able to deliver the results that the person is looking for using a simple but innovative training system. And it sounds like you wanted to speak about that, Josh, so I'll let you take it from there.
Yeah, and there is actually so much to cover because when I got into coaching, it was very informal, and I had influences, but I never had any direct interaction with them. So it was very much like getting a program from someone, trying to reverse engineer it to make sense of it, which like taught me a lot of methods. And then I started getting into the influences of like a Mike Tashir and coaches like that who have like a very different approach to programming. It is different in that, like, when you hear them talk about periodization, like I think of more critiques against classical periodization versus like being a proponent of. So I actually came from the opposite side, and I know your background is like when you started off, it was an interest in periodization. So I think what I've kind of picked up from just listening to you talk about it is how you can make sense of all of the information that you can get in and how you can still be an active participant in changing the training of an athlete and how you can use monitoring to adjust all of that. But before we, really dive into the meat and potatoes, I would like to hear how you kind of co-founded the Strength Guys, because it is an interesting story. And I think in a world where people are trying to find a place and carve out some sort of segment of the remote coaching space, I think it helps to hear from someone who's done it and done it very, very well. So maybe you can just go through your background a bit, and we can kind of cover, what you thought you did well, and looking back, what you wish you would have done differently.
Yeah, thank you for that, first of all. So I'll say that when the Strength Guys started 10 years ago, or almost 10 years ago, the fitness industry was a very different place, especially online. It seems like online training has grown tenfold from where it was back in 2011. It was when we started doing programming, and back in 2010 when we really started our page. I started the Strength Guys with my friend from university, Anthony Walker. He had thought of the name. It was purely that we both wanted to go back and get more knowledge, and we wanted to avoid kind of punching in and punching out for 40, 50 hours a week at a commercial gym. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but I grew up a massive, massive sports fan. I knew that I wanted some opportunity in professional sports or collegiate sports. So the Strength Guys was just for the purpose of networking. And so every day, at least twice per day for an entire year without fail, I would just tweet out thoughts and ideas and communicate with people, get to know people in the community on Twitter back then. And over time, like, we were able to gain over 1,000 followers in our first year. Got to meet numerous influential figures now, and people started requesting programming. But the thing I told them was, this isn't a company. Like, we don't do any services. And I kept getting these requests for programming, which I think it's the lesson that, like, the market was telling me they were interested in what we did. So finally, I was like, all right, well, I'll start doing programming. Started down that road. Within my first year of coaching, I had acquired Jeff Nippard, a natural bodybuilder, and at that time he wanted to be really good at powerlifting as well. And of course now he's a very prominent figure in the industry. We had numerous other, I say, like, prominent or influential figures in the industry who started off as clients with us as well. And I remember seeing that Mark Martin, the NASCAR driver, followed us on Twitter a few months after we had started doing programming. So I just reached out. I sent him a DM. I followed him back, and I'm like, hey, Mark, like, you interested in trying our training, right? Because I think a lot of people are afraid to reach out to people and just network and communicate and get your hands dirty with it. But in all honesty, the worst thing that could have happened for me reaching out to Mark was him not responding, or him saying, no, thank you, I'm just interested in following your content. And so Mark actually sent me his phone number back. And so I called him that night. I convinced him to give us a try. And TSG kind of rode the wave of training Jeff Nippard while he was getting really, really strong really quickly, and Mark Martin to growing our brand awareness. A few years later, Taylor Atwood signed up. Taylor Atwood had just finished his first meet as a powerlifter as a local competition, and he wanted to become the national champion in the USA. Taylor signed up through a friend of Jeff's, because at that time we were primarily a natural bodybuilding company. But I think whenever people see someone who's, they look the part and they're lifting the part, that's very, that's the standard. That's the ideal. And through Jeff, he really helped us grow our business in the early days. And I think Travis, the guy who referred Taylor, and Taylor In some indirect way, we have Jeff to thank for that, because I think he's one of the figures that put us on the map. So within 4 months, Taylor was a national champion. He had tied the total of the world champion at Raw Nationals. That was in 2014 in Denver. Taylor hasn't lost since. So he has the longest active win streak of any American powerlifter at Raw Nationals. He's won 6 in a row now. We had numerous, bumps and bruises along the way with Taylor, but at that Raw Nationals, we also met influential figures like John Downing, and the company gradually shifted gears away from being a natural bodybuilding company towards being a drug-free powerlifting training company. Through the bumps and bruises that I accumulated with Taylor Atwood and John Downing and Clinton Lee and others, we were able to learn a lot and innovate a lot. And I think the thing I realized as I was shifting away from natural bodybuilding, which was my training background and competitive background at the time, I had coached Taylor to a national championship in powerlifting before I had even competed in powerlifting as an athlete. It was very interesting, and it was very much a baptism by fire experience for me. Is that I needed mentoring in powerlifting as well. And so I sought out the mentorship of the 2 best coaches that I viewed in the world. And that was Matt Gary for his game day coaching expertise. And that was also Ben Esgro for his programming, because I saw Ben Esgro's clients showing up at meets and they were winning competitions that they shouldn't be winning, just based on these guys are always making their lifts. They're generally progressing. And, at that time he had Lane Norton going, and that was kind of like the star client of his roster. And he took Lane and turned him into the silver medalist in the world, right? Like, I don't think a lot of people saw that coming outside of them. And so I kind of devoted myself to just listening and learning from these experts and using my creative mind to craft an approach that would complement the knowledge that they were so openly and graciously sharing with me. And I was able to pass that down to all of my team members as well. And I feel like it's just been such a game changer for us since I did those 2 mentorship experiences, and really they're ongoing because I'm great friends with Matt and Ben to this day. But that's changed the game for us with the strength guys, because I was able to listen and learn and interpret what these coaches were doing and use my creative skill set in order to actually make it into like some complete form of a training system. And since we've done that, we've won 3 world championships in the past 2 years. We've coached the best lifter. And I think like any major competition that like Alfred, Ben Kedrick, or I have attended, I don't think we've lost in the past 3 years. So we've been on quite the roll, and it's been a blast, as it is whenever a sports team is winning. So that's the wave that we're currently on.
Yeah, and just for context, because a lot of the listeners, they come from the sport of weightlifting. So powerlifting is, very similar, but maybe the names aren't quite as well known. So, for example, Taylor Atwood, I know that he's like incredible. Maybe you can give his best numbers just for people listening, so they can really contextualize, his dominance.
Yeah, so Taylor Atwood is the number 1 ranked lifter in the world. He's a 74 kilo world champion of 2018 and 2019. His best performance to date was a 283 kilo squat at Worlds, which is a world record at 74. a 195 kilo bench press and a 312.5 kilo deadlift. Um, and since then, he's made more progress on each of his lifts, but had a little injury at his last competition, so didn't really get to show his new level of performance yet.
Yeah, and that's incredible. So what was it like? You said that you started coaching Taylor before you had done a meet. I mean, what is it like knowing that, you've had this success, but you haven't been as involved in the sport? Because I know a lot of people just assume that, like, to be a really good coach, you have to have done it for a long period of time and had a lot of success. So what was it like not having that athletic experience, but then having that massive success as a coach?
Well, I realized early on that I needed to compete, so I quickly prepared myself for a powerlifting meet and got on the platform myself because I knew I had to experience it. Um, one of my friends in Italy, Carlo Busicelli, told me you don't need to be a horse to be a horseback rider, but like what he was saying by that is you do need to have some experience, right? And what I think with my story, there's benefits, and I think there's also some drawbacks in being an experience based coach. And I think the drawbacks to that are it can really narrow your scope in terms of what you're focusing on. And I've seen older figureheads and people who are more experience based really hone in on what worked for them. But what worked for them and what works for others, especially when you're looking at coaching uh, top level lifters in the world, usually these are the outliers, right? Like um, it's uncommon to find an outlier who just has a standard response to training. And so I've noticed in time that there's a lot of individualization, sorry, that these outliers need. And my approach in order to kind of make up and I guess still be effective uh, without that, large experience background as an athlete in the sport was to look at workload management and to be a recipient of mentoring from world champion coaches when they've been willing to uh, provide it. And so, what Ben and I do, and the system that we've really come up with, is based on analyzing weekly training volumes, chronic training volumes, so 4 week training volumes, um, average intensity, so whether that's percentage of 1 rep maximum or average RPE of your work sets across a week, and the 1 rep maximum, which is obviously what we're trying to change. And I think the contrast to the other protocols that I've seen, which are popular in powerlifting, is they're more focused on what you're doing in the individual sessions. And obviously there's importance to both big picture thinking. So by big picture, I'm saying what you've done over like the last 3 or 4 weeks. And there's importance in what those sessions look like in terms of exercise selection and tempo and all that kind of stuff. But the genius of the programming system that Ben was using was he was doing squat, bench press, and deadlift in competition stance. Was rarely doing any sort of special exercise to drive strength. The only time we've used special exercises was really to reinforce a cue or a technical concept of lifters. And by virtue of manipulating the chronic training load, weekly training load, uh, and average intensity of the lifter, which is usually on a linear periodized scheme, um, while using daily undulating periodization on a weekly basis, um, we've been able to change the entire equation for lifters who I think with that more special exercise, like very, you know, how do I say, like maybe myopic focus on what each workout is and how each workout is built. We've been able to change the equation for them and to level their performance up to levels that beforehand we didn't think was possible. Um, and so that's the biggest lesson and difference for me is I really had to learn to manage workloads and to understand that in training people like Taylor or Eli, I'm never going to know what it's like to be able to deadlift 800 plus pounds like Eli can. But the one thing that our system affords us that I feel like a lot of others fall short on is we have a system of checks and balances so that we can write programming that's, relative to Eli's ability and training history. And we do that through workload management principles.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, so there may be a couple talking points to this, and we'll kind of go through them, but I think the initial barrier to entry when someone wants to use this sort of methodology of tracking data is, when you get a new athlete or when you just start, it's like, where do you begin? Right? Because you can't really go to a textbook necessarily and say, okay, here's someone with this amount of experience in this training background, therefore they should lift this much weight in terms of like volume. So how did you develop the process of like, okay, let's start tracking, and then when you get new athletes, what's the process of developing some sort of framework to work off of? So when you have a competition coming up, you can say, we've been here before, we know what works, we know what doesn't, or at least we have some sort of proximity to that, so we can play around with it and make our best guess, really.
Yeah, so a new client will sign up, and let's say it's a lifter who has been stuck in the water for like the past few months, hasn't been making progress, but they're healthy, right? Because there's a lot of different permutations of who could sign up with different injuries and training backgrounds and so on and so forth. Um, First thing that we're going to do is we're going to look at their lifting frequency. And we understand that on average, our workouts are harder than most powerlifting workouts, meaning that we have different microcycle or week classifications. We have intro weeks, which are generally like RP5 or 6 work sets. We have build weeks, which are like RP7 work sets. And then we have attack weeks that are RP8 work sets. And we also have taper weeks, which are called recover weeks. So for us to classify that someone is truly training at a 2 time per week frequency or a 3 time per week frequency on a lift, they have to check off numerous boxes. And the first box is, are you doing squat once a week and something that is kind of a competition squat on the other day of the week, or are you doing competition squat twice a week? Because we're evaluating you based on specificity, and we follow a motor learning based approach. So we want you to practice the competition squat, and we will coach you like to a very, very fine level of detail in the competition squat. But that approach is preferable to us over doing a lot of variations of the competition squat. So if you check that first box off, the next thing that we're going to look at is how hard were you training on those 2 days per week. Unless you're doing, straight work sets at like RP7 or 8, we're not going to consider you as truly having maxed out what you could do training 2 times per week. And so if you haven't maxed out how hard you can train 2 times per week of a lift, that's going to be our start point, is we're going to train you 2 times per week on that lift. And if you have, and it's just not working, we'll bump you up to, 2 hard sessions and maybe 1 easier session, which increases in difficulty as needed. So we're just looking at how to provide progressive overload to the person while doing as little as possible at the start in order to avoid the injury risk. The other really important thing about our training is that it's very specific to how you compete. So it's back squat, bench press, deadlift. And we train that, like I say, 80% of the time. That's how you do your lifts. And of course, there are some general exercises, and if there's a technique concept to get home, maybe a special exercise once a week or something like that. But the primary thing in the program is how you're training your main lifts, and that you're training them in order like you are in competition. So we also, because a lot of people don't do that, and I've noticed a trend where lifters will just kind of like fall off as the competition goes on. And although powerlifting competition is 3 sets of 1 per lift, generally like very rough guidelines, like 90, 95, and 100% of 1 rep maximum, right? Like that would be very simplified looking at powerlifting meet attempt selection. People just crap out and get tired around deadlift. And for us, we don't want to know what you can deadlift when you're fresh. We want to know what you can deadlift after you've done squat and bench, because that's what we got to do on game day. And so that's hard for a lot of people when they start our training. And it's a common theme that a lot of people don't have the work capacity right out of the get-go when they start our training. And deadlift usually feels a heck of a lot heavier after you've done hard squat and bench press training, and then you've got to pull, than it does when you're fresh. So the next component of us starting up a client is that we purposefully commit a type 2 error, and we undershoot their 1RMs. That may be by 2.5 or 5%, but it just gives us some leeway in terms of this person may struggle for the first 3 to 4 weeks until they adapt to this new method of training. And at least if they are struggling a bit, they're not going to fail work sets, or they're a lot less likely to fail work sets while they're catching up. And then from there, we'll bring the 1RMs back up once performance dictates that they're ready for it, and we'll begin following our standardized training model. But that's generally the assessment and thought process that goes into starting someone off. Of course, there's video analysis and coaching as well, which is, I have a lot to say on that also. So it depends if you'd like to go down that rabbit hole or keep going on the programming track for this podcast, really.
Yeah, and I just kind of wonder, listening to you talk about this, and I've listened to Max Zeta, who's a very well-respected weightlifting coach, and the thing he says that separates his coaching from maybe another coach or just a good coach from a bad coach, or I don't remember exactly how he framed it, but like the attention to detail, where you write a program and for the next few hours or something, you're looking through it and trying to assess it and trying to analyze it and figure out what could go wrong and what's right about it. Do you think this level of effort that you're putting to it should be kind of standardized in the sport of powerlifting and strength sports in general? Because I noticed that this isn't common, at least not to this degree. And like, I guess that's good for you in driving traffic, but do you feel like most coaches should try to adopt this kind of framework where it is heavily attended to the athlete and exploiting as much as possible? Or is it, some coaches might say that the data can become excessive and you shouldn't, drive programming based off of that? And I'm just curious where you stand with the field at large of coaching in the strength sports, powerlifting and weightlifting.
I think that looking at the big picture of programming when writing training, rather than writing like unique training blocks, and I think that can benefit anybody. I'm not saying that everyone should adopt it, because, for example, with RPE-based training, which is really popularized by reactive training systems and Mike Teixeira, really you're managing, you are linear periodizing it when the lifter is progressing, when they're in periods where training's going well, and volume's going to go up as a result, and you're consistently getting a decently high chronic training load at sport specific intensities. And he kind of lets the lifter performance influence progression of workload, whereas we're controlling it a lot more from our end by coding in, sets and reps and manipulating the 1 rep maximum based on assessments and so on and so forth. So it depends on the angle that you're taking to solve your problem. But certainly, I've looked at a lot of programs from a lot of coaches, and including myself, like last year. And this is why I've built 7 editions of our athlete management system, which allows us to see the training data in live time as we're writing the programs and smooth out any spikes in training load, or make sure that we're adequately preparing an athlete for their developmental and competition phases later on in a macro cycle. It's very common to see workload errors where like training is introduced too aggressively in a certain area, or chronic training load is low, and people are wondering like, why aren't I adapting, right? Like, what's going on? And it's also common to see spikes in workload, right, where people work up too fast. So the analogy of a lifter who goes from a chill 2 time per week program to doing the small up program, you're probably going to get crushed because it's at least twice as much volume as you were doing, right? And you just spiked your workload. You don't have the work capacity to handle that. And so for us, the big picture thinking has allowed us to get rid of spikes in training workload, to gradually introduce training concepts, and to ensure that we are, building capacity and prescribing training based on a rough measure of that athlete's capacity once we've done so. So I know it's hard to illustrate what that looks like via audio, but these are the benefits of workload management that I think are missed in many, many programs.
Yeah, and for people who are interested in checking out exactly what you're talking about, Jason, you can go to the Strength Guys Instagram and look at some of the posts you've put up where you're actually like scanning through the programs and looking at individual pages, and I think that gives you like a better illustration of what all goes into this. And that's actually one thing I've experienced too. Is I thought it's not that I don't think RPE is useful. I think it is, and I think there's some research validating its use, and obviously with practice. But when you're trying to track information and keep hold on the amount of work someone's doing and the changes to that work and the weights, the relative intensities, it is harder with RPEs or like certain strategies of you working up for the day to kind of see where you're at and then having to reconfigure after the fact to make the adjustments. I think almost to be a bit cleaner, you have to figure that all in beforehand. What's your process of making adjustments during or after the fact if there is some sort of conflict of performance and expected performance? Or do you have some sort of grip on if that's going to happen based on like the athlete monitoring information that you're getting in?
Yeah, so we follow, I said this earlier, but we follow a daily undulating periodization structure for our weeks and a linear periodization structure for prescribing intensities. So what that means for us in relation to like a competition macro cycle, so let's say like 12 weeks until your competition, is first phase we're going to work on. It's going to be a preparatory phase, so the weights that you're lifting are generally going to be between 70 and 80%, maybe slightly higher. But we're going to be prioritizing a buildup of higher reps, and we're going to be prioritizing hitting what we call peak volume. And lately, I've been experimenting with the idea of achieving a chronic peak volume. And what the peak refers to is the maximum that you've ever done in the preparatory phase. So this is the highest weekly volume that you've ever lifted or the highest 4-week average volume that you've ever done. And the idea of that is work capacity, and the secondary idea of that is volume drive strength and muscle gain. And this has been shown and pretty well supported in the literature as well. So we're prioritizing that in our first phase. And once we've built up our work capacity, and hopefully we've ended that phase with an assessment where the lifter was able to achieve some sort of rep PR in their assessment to indicate that strength has been gained, we very gradually transition them into our development phase, which is roughly 80 to 90% of the 1 rep maximum. And these are very rough generalizations, but with lower reps. And when you lower the reps, you are decreasing the volume by a lot unless you account for the sets. And so generally we'll increase the number of sets in the development phase so that the lifter is getting more sport-specific practice at heavier weights. And we try to keep them relatively close to their chronic peak volume that they achieved in the preparatory phase or their weekly peak volume. So we can look at it as trying to be as close as possible, right? And we monitor the athlete to see if they're responding well and if they're healthy, and if it seems like performance is actually on the up by just watching their videos and talking to them. Or we may aim for something like 75% of the peak volume that we hit in the preparatory phase, and we'll train at that in the development phase. But this is where you could start to differentiate the strategy from individual to individual. So development phase is where we expect to really start gaining some ground with strength, because we're doing a lot of sport specific and higher intensity practice. And then the final 4 weeks of the competition phase, the development phase, we usually conclude it with some sort of assessment again. So ideal outcome is that you've increased your, a rep max, or you've hit a PR like RP triple or RPE triple or something like that, or your velocity based training profile this go around during assessments was X% better than the last go around during assessments. Like, these are all indicators that we'll use for progress. The competition phase is where we have a 2-week overreaching period that starts 3 weeks out from the contest, where now we're practicing anywhere between 80 and 95% of the 1 rep maximum. And our main goal of the competition phase is actually to put together the best possible meet strategy that we can. Our secondary goal is to peak strength for the contest. So for 3 weeks out and 2 weeks out from the competition, we're taking a lot of high intensity lifts, and oftentimes our lifters will perform their opening attempts in competition, I guess you would say at the end of the 3-week out period. So however many days out from the competition that is. They'll do it for numerous singles or doubles, which will all be subject to video analysis from the side perspective by the coach. And really, when we're watching these videos, we're looking at them like a ref would, like, would this count in competition? And then the second thing we're looking at is, how did that look? Like, would we be comfortable opening at that in competition? And then once they've done numerous work sets, we will do some sort of assessment. So whether that's a 3 rep max or a 5 rep max at the weight that they've already lifted for numerous work sets. And that'll tell us how effective they are at being able to replicate these efforts. And it's very confident building for lifters to know that they've hit their opening attempt for 3 or 5 reps, a few weeks out from the contest. Based on video analysis and the assessment results, we will slot in what their opener for the competition will be, and then we'll decide on what the second attempt will be for the competition. And 8 days out from the contest, we will practice the second attempts in squat, bench press, deadlift format for numerous singles. And these will all be subject to video analysis, really from a refereeing perspective. Would this count? How did that look? And so by the end of our overreaching period, our athletes have performed tons of reps with their openers and their second attempts, which is 6 out of 9 lifts in the competition. And all the time this has happened, we've been watching it from the perspective of what might they be capable of lifting on their third attempt. And so once we've seen their openers and their second attempts, we slot in the range of what they may fall within for their third attempts based on the jumps that we made from opener to second, and also based on the strength potential that they showed. We follow a very quick step taper model where we taper only for the final week. And to be honest, we taper with a lot of competition practice as well. The work sets will be easy, but you'll be doing 80 to 85% of your 1 rep maximum. The only difference is instead of doing that for like sets of 5, you'll be doing it for sets of 3 or sets of 2. But it's common for us to prescribe anywhere from like 6 to 8 sets per workout per lift in a taper. And of course, we make some adjustments here or there as well. We actually use the mesocycle peak volume of the competition phase. So the most amount of volume that was done on a weekly basis in the competition phase as our guideline for how much we are going to taper volume from that week of the program for the final taper week. So we adjust the frequency to account for the competition. So that means that if you were squatting 3 times per week in training, you're only going to do 2 taper squat sessions, and then your third squat session would be the competition. If you're benching 4 times a week, you do 3 bench sessions, and then your fourth would be the competition. Usually our clients only deadlift twice a week, so their second deadlift session would be competition. And we create their taper based on percentages of their mesocycle peak volume. And that's how we bring lifters into the contest. So there's a lot of looking at what's our chronic training load, what's our weekly peak volume overall for the macro cycle, for the mesocycle, and a lot of looking at how much am I changing last week's training load by doing this adjustment. And so you're exactly right, because we look at all these things in advance before we send it out to the client. And they are provided with some adjustment guidelines in case the percentage of 1 rep maximum is too hard or too easy. But for us, it's more important to know that we're avoiding spikes in workloads or drop-offs in workload that I think really mess up a lot of lifters as they try to peak themselves for competition. Because, if you make a lot of gains when you're doing a volume phase and then you drop the reps and your strength falls off a cliff, maybe it's because you're not practicing enough anymore because you dropped your reps, right? So increase your sets to compensate for that. And these are the workload management things that we look at least a few of them.
Yeah, that was maybe the I don't want to say the best, but it was definitely the most comprehensive answer I've received to a question. And honestly, I love it because like every time I listen to you on another podcast, I'm kind of hoping that there's like the next layer kind of pulled back to get a little more insight into the process that you guys use. So it's really interesting to hear that. And one of the questions I guess I have curtailing off of that, I noticed that a lot of people struggle with realizing their strength because of an inattention to volume fluctuations. Do you have any specific protocol that you use, say, during a taper or during some sort of down week, or what kind of fluctuations are you looking at to maintain kind of what the person has been developing over time so that they don't have that fall off and subsequent plateauing that is all too common during a taper or like testing week?
Yeah, so I use acute to chronic training workload ratio. This ratio is calculated as what's your weekly volume, and I do it per lift, so squat, bench press, deadlift, and I do the total. So the total up, squat, bench press, and deadlift. And you divide that over your 4-week average for that lift or the total of the lifts. And that'll give you a ratio. And there's no research on this in powerlifting, but it's kind of using common sense and also making some assumptions here. When I am, so in standard tapering, I will drop volume by 40 to 50%, right? So let's say that you just completed, 2 or 3 attack weeks in a row of RPE 8 work sets. We got some productive training done. Now it's time to taper you and put you through an assessment to see where we've gotten. I may just slash your work sets by half, or I may make your work sets a little bit easier by dropping 2 reps and keeping the weight the same or something like that. But either way, we're looking at like a 40 to 50% volume reduction from the previous week. And intensity stays high. Those are tapering 101 guidelines. For the competition taper, we follow our own percentage-based guidelines on what to reduce mesocycle peak volume by for the taper week. So it's a little bit different. But coming out of the taper is where you have to be really mindful not to spike workload too much, especially when you're already training hard. I think there's 2 mistakes that people can make coming out of the taper. One is taking too long and kind of now you're decreasing your chronic training load because you're going through an introductory period for the next block, and that's just not necessary, right? Like if you've already completed that preparatory phase and you've increased your work capacity, once you're done the taper, you've got to get back to training and a decently high training load right away. Otherwise, you're just going to start to fade. So one mistake people do is taking too long and treating each block like I need to go through an intro week and then a transition period before I get to the hardest training, because that may take 3 to 4 weeks in itself. And that's the point of the preparatory phase. So that can't be lost on. The other mistake is going right back to the hard training that you're doing before the taper week, because now you've just spiked training workload. And so in Dr. Tim Gabbitt's research, and Tim Gabbett is kind of like the guy when it comes to workload management research, although this hasn't been done on powerlifters, he said that more injuries happen than not when an athlete is subjected to chronic training loads below 0.8, acute to chronic training load ratio below 0.8 or above 1.3. So what this means is that if you undertrain, you're not prepared for the demands of your sport. And if you overtrain or if you spike workload too fast, you may increase your risk for injury. So when I'm planning that transition period out of a taper, I generally aim to keep the acute to chronic training workload ratio for the next 3 weeks after the taper at or below 1.3. So that's the mark I look to with the acute to chronic workload ratio. And that just means that I'm not causing a spike in training load. So that's all that is. And that's kind of the protocol I use when I'm looking at the numbers in order to smooth out the training on a week-to-week basis.
Yeah. And now that you have pretty much like a decade of coaching under your belt and a decade of working on, every single thing that's involved with how you coach now, kind of looking back, is there something you wish you would have known or done differently? Again, kind of for the newer coaches listening who are sort of at the start or, in the middle of their journey trying to figure things out?
I would have went a lot harder emphasis on teaching myself the most relevant biomechanics and fine details of the lifting. early last year, I developed something called the Power Portfolio. And what that is a 74-page PowerPoint that I send to all my lifters. And this PowerPoint has videos, it has voiceovers, it has animations, it has GIFs, um, and it has written explanations of every detail that I want my lifters to be executing on when they're squatting, benching, or deadlifting. So it's my way of, if they can't train with me in person, this is the next best thing that I can give them to where I want to show them how to lift and how to um, do so safely and efficiently. Because I think lifting technique is foundation of being able to handle higher training workloads. If you're not efficient or if you're doing more mechanical work that's necessary, high workloads are going to tax you more. Um, and that's just the physiological way of looking at it. So, and where I think that would have really helped is when I think back on like Taylor Atwood and I's first world championship. Taylor was 8 for 8 going into his final deadlift, and he literally just had a brain fart. He stood up with his final deadlift that would have won him his first world championship, forgot to extend his knees, got called for soft knees, ended up placing second. So if I were to teach him technique with a lot more focus and strictness back then, I believe we would be 3-time world champions instead of 2-time. I also believe that, some client injuries along the way would have been prevented through that. So I think the most important thing would be prioritizing becoming the most detail-oriented and effective coach I possibly can. And also going past the excuses that you can't coach technique online, like you need to train people in person, because I think that's for weightlifting, it's a lot harder, but for powerlifting, it's a load of crap, right? Like you can completely teach it online. And I'll say 1,000%, I learned more from watching a 50-minute video of Ben walking through how to squat on YouTube in his home gym than I did from any coach I'd ever had before, So you can absolutely learn online. And I don't think that the online coach should accept anything less than providing their clients with their absolute best. And so what's driven my professional development is, I want to know their training workloads, and I want to know that I'm managing this as best as possible according to research. I also want them to feel supported as much as possible from a technical perspective, and also from a nutrition perspective and a injury prevention perspective. And so the Strength Guys has been built in that vision. I just wish I would have started the process a little bit earlier is all.
Yeah, and we know that obviously a lot, and we can tell, like anyone can tell listening to you, that a lot goes into the programming and the technical training of an athlete. You said you spent a lot of time with Brett, who wrote a really well-known book on kind of the soft skills of coaching. What's your take on that, and how do you go about developing relationships with athletes to help with buy-in? And I mean, obviously when you're dealing with higher level athletes, people really at the top, like they're driven, so you probably have to do less than with someone who's just like a casual, just kind of does it for fun. But what's your approach to building relationships and building buy-in, and then creating something that can help the lifter through the ups and downs and through the kind of the years and years of training that it takes to be the best?
Yeah. So I'd say first of all, I think Brett he has gift of gab, right? Like he's very gifted at communicating and reaching and motivating a large variety of people and populations. And I was quite involved with the release of conscious coaching as well as the development of some of its materials. So I'm very familiar with it. And I think at that time when I was working for Brett, I kind of felt inferior in that, like, man, he's so good at these things, and And these tactics work so well for him. And I didn't really know how I could translate it. But in looking back on it, I think I was able to build buy-in with higher level athletes and with, people from all walks of life based on a detail oriented approach that was coming from a basis of education. Um, for me, that and showing that I genuinely cared about the work I was doing and the people I was working with, simple things like be on time, don't send crappy emails, like explain a little bit what you're doing and why. Check in with them. These things really matter to people. And that's allowed, honestly, it's kept my career afloat, because during the early days of my career where I made some mistakes, um, people like Taylor and John Downing and Mark Martin and Jeff Nippard, they stuck by me and they're like, I trust you, Jason, that you're going to learn from this mistake and you're not going to make it again. And I think the next part of building buy-in was that I didn't make the mistakes again with them, right? Like I did show them that I learned from it and that I was going to get better from it. And so I think that's very important, because I think everyone's going to make mistakes, especially when you're learning and you're a young professional. Now I like to, find what my lifters like. So, if they like talking about golfing or hiking in and around Alberta, or, Taylor likes to talk about NFL and his Miami Dolphins. He likes to talk about NBA. So build a friendship with them based on these activities that we have in common. That's another thing that just builds the bond. And I think the final common tactic that I use and that I learned from Brett and also from my brilliant colleague Kedrick Kwan in New Zealand is speak to behaviors when you're giving compliments, right? Like saying great job on getting through the training session, Josh. Say, you've been very disciplined and dedicated and committed, Josh, and like fantastic stuff, right? Like compliment behaviors, because that builds the relationship a little bit more. And these are just the things that I try to do. Prioritize timeliness and try to find common activities with people, or types of music that you like, and talk about them, and just continue to show care and a lot of pride in my work. And that's been enough for me those have been my conscious coaching methods, if you will, to build the client base that I have.
Yeah, and I think I was just recently listening to a podcast you were on where you talked about the amount of work and effort that goes into coaching. And that's also what I found as I've realized that it's not just like a sets and reps thing. And I never, I'm not trying to create a straw man. Like I never really thought it was just that. But I've realized that there is a lot of attention to detail, not only with respect to the programming or the other variables that influence performance, but it is like getting to know the whole person, not just the athlete, and caring for the whole person, and putting in is just as much effort for that as you would with the sets and reps and the other pieces of the training plan. And I guess, I mean, you kind of summed it up well when you just talked about, again, the amount of work that it takes. And I guess what that does is for me, it reinforces that you're doing it properly. You're not like, it's not over excessive, and it's not working too hard for too little. It's doing the right amount for the right person. So for people listening, I guess that's just like a reason you should go type Jason Tremblay in the iTunes podcast app and listen to some stuff, because there's a lot of gold there. And now I'd love, before we kind of get off the call, to get your biggest resources for people who are listening and would love to check them out. Just stuff that has really influenced you over the time, not necessarily people, but like books or articles or ideas that have really stuck and affected the way you coach powerlifters.
Yeah. I first off, thank you for that. I'd say for the resources, A Coach's Guide to Strength Development on Stuart McMillan's website is fantastic. especially part one by Dr. Matt Jordan, where he walks through the physiology of strength training. It's like a free kinesiology degree. Like it's like a free university exercise phys class for strength training. And I think that everyone should read that article because it's absolutely fantastic. Our power portfolio, which I built based on years of material that Ben and I had worked on together as well. And if you want that, you could just contact me via email, jason@thestrengthguys.com, and I could share with you what the rate is to purchase it. That's been fantastic because it's actually given us a curriculum to coach technique on, and our athletes actually know what they're being evaluated on. So, if they're messing up, they have to choose. They know that they should have been doing it right, and it seems fair to coach them this way. I'd also say the work of Dr. Tim Gabbett has been very influential to me. The work of Dr. Brandon Roberts in our group, he kind of just keeps our group abreast and up to date on the current literature at all times, and that's his role in our group. It's been fantastic in keeping us up to date. I would recommend that everyone watch Ben Escrow How to Squat and Ben Escrow How to Deadlift on YouTube. And I would recommend people watch Greg Knuckles' Work Capacity on YouTube because that's a fantastic article as well. And I think if people are looking for more info on how to stay up to date, subscribe to Mass. It's the strength-based research review by Dr. Eric Helms, Greg Knuckles, and Dr. Mike Sordos, because they've all done exceptional work. So those are the resources that I think have helped me most. I guess the final one, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention it, is to look up as much of Matt Gary's work as possible. He's so ahead of the curve as a coach in powerlifting. And although we may have differences in terms of workload provided and all that, Matt was doing it before us when it came to smoothing out workloads and really analyzing his program before he sent it out. He's the most detail oriented coach I know. I can't say enough good things about him, and I'd say he's an absolute pioneer for powerlifting coaching. And I think the principles of attempt selection that Matt has popularized would also translate very, very, very well to weightlifting also.
Yeah, and that's awesome. And I've actually pulled up a few tabs to make sure I don't forget to check out a few of those resources. And if people want, obviously, more information from you, because I know you guys are doing a lot of great work and putting out a lot of good content, where can they check that out at? And are there any kind of projects in the works that we can expect to hear about soon?
So we primarily post our content on Instagram at The Strength Guys. We also have Facebook, where Instagram content gets posted on, and Twitter, which is no longer active, but it's up there at The Strength Guys. Our website is www.thestrengthguys.com. We're currently working on a educational content, I guess, how do we say, a collaboration with King of Lifts, which is the, I guess you would call it the primary media source for powerlifting. That collaboration is 15 posts in now. It's called Positions of Power. So if you look up hashtag positions of power, you will see numerous high-level, high-detail technique posts that we've created for the King of Lifts page. And there will be more details to announce on that project in the coming weeks. Aside from that, I'm also working on preparing the sports science applications for the Calgary Flames 2020 and 21 NHL season. This will be my second year working with the team. So just making some refinements in that area, and also trying to take what I can from the NHL and apply it into the IPF, right? Apply it into powerlifting and enhance our operation even more. So just some cool things that I'm working on. And yeah, if you ever want to reach me personally, my email is jason@thestrengthguys.com. I hardly ever post to Instagram, but my Instagram is at JasonTSG.
Yeah, and I would definitely implore people to go check out those resources. I mean, it could really change your coaching if you happen to stumble upon something that you haven't been incorporating or implementing or paying attention to. And it can lead you down, many different rabbit holes, as it's done for myself. So, Jason, I really appreciate the time and the conversation. Hopefully it's been beneficial for everyone. And for people listening, if you like the podcast, feel free to give it a share to your close powerlifting or weightlifting friends. And I guess we'll catch you guys next week on another episode of the Weightlifting House podcast.